It's a pleasure to be with you today. On behalf of the officers and staff at the Alberta Conference Office, we want to extend greetings to each and every one of you. As I look out at the congregation today, it's nice to see a few familiar faces and to remember a few of you. Marilyn, of course, is standing head and shoulders over everyone, as she always. Marilyn Kellaway. And Bruce and I go back many years to the St. John's Newfoundland Church. He served as an elder there, and I was a pastor there a number of years ago. I see the Jeromes are here, and it's good to see you. And there are several others, I'm sure, that I know this morning as well. My wife, Elmira, I don't know if she has stood, but if she would like to, and wave to everyone. She tries to make it as much as she can with me, and that's always a pleasure to do. I was last at this church about 20 years ago. So I began my ministry right here in Alberta. I left Newfoundland as a teenager and ventured out to what was CUC. And when I was completed the program there, had an opportunity to pastor. So I spent a number of years here in Edmonton, at the Edmonton Central Church, of course, Sylvan Lake, and also in Medicine Hat to the east of here. So I had an opportunity to spend a considerable time here. My wife and I have 5 children, and I'm sure there are several families here with more children than that, and I'm very happy to pass on the baton to anyone who wishes. But it's good to be with you. This morning I want to take a few moments with you and look at a story that we find in the book of Matthew chapter 14. It's a story that's familiar to you, and I'd like to read just a few verses from that story. It says in verse 22, "And immediately he made the disciples get into the boat," that is speaking of Jesus, "and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And after he had sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already many stadia away from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were frightened, saying, 'It is a ghost.' And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered and said, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.'" I like this story. I actually have spent, growing up in Newfoundland, quite a bit of time on the water. Where we live was probably about 40 yards from the ocean. And so our house was nestled on the side of a little hill, and the water was before us. And one of the things we liked to do as children in those days, we had a dory. It's called a dory. It was about 16 feet long or so, and it was moored out there. And so when we got a particularly stormy day, the kids, myself included, we would go down and pull the boat in. It was on one of these pulley systems tied to the wharf, and so you could reel it in. And we would get in this, and we could reel ourselves out. And I liked a really stormy day because you could get in that boat and you could bounce the waves. You know, you would hit the waves. And several of us could really make that thing go up and down, almost so it would go under. This particular story reminds me a little bit of this. But it's a story that is filled with adventure. It is a story filled with daring. And it is a story filled with hope. Jesus, the setting for this, of course, just prior to this incident occurring, Jesus had fed the 5,000 on the hillside. He had spent the day with them, healed countless people who came forward with a variety of ailments and difficulties and diseases and all of those things. And he spent hours and hours, probably 14, 15 hours from early morning late into the day. And finally, he was exhausted, and he said to the disciples, I need to spend a little time by myself. It's great to be with people. It's great to be with crowds. It's great to have lots of people by, but every once in a while you need to go off by yourself. And Jesus certainly needed that. So he made arrangements, and he said to the disciples, you folks go ahead, make your way across the Sea of Galilee, and I will take the shore route, and I'll spend some time in the mountains. So the disciples got aboard the boat. There were, of course, 12 of them. The 12 disciples, we all know them well, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, and Judas, and Matthew, and so forth and so on. And they were there. They made their way out what began perhaps as a promising night on the Sea of Galilee, making their way. Perhaps it was a moonlit night, very, very nice to begin with. But as they got out on the Sea of Galilee, I don't know, have many of you been to the Sea of Galilee? Some of you have, I'm sure. There are 2, 3 of you who have been to the Sea of Galilee. Elmira and I had the privilege a couple of years ago to go there. And Galilee is not a big place. It's about 20 kilometers, I think, from north to south, and about 13 or so across. So it's not a big place, but still it's big enough when you have several miles to travel on the water. And so when they got out there, the weather, it says, turned contrary. And so the waves were being propelled by the high winds that were whipped off the hills on either side of the Sea of Galilee. And they were not in a particularly large boat. The boat that I was in as a child, the dory, was not a whole lot different in size than the boat they would have been in. While visiting in Israel, there by the Sea of Galilee, in Capernaum, there is a place where you can go, and it's you can see the boat. They discovered a boat from the 1st century A.D. One of these little fishing boats that were so typical on the Sea of Galilee. So they found it, and they were able, with a great deal of effort, to excavate this boat and to move it. And of course, there's a museum built around it now. And this boat was probably not more than about 16, 18 feet long. It's not a big boat, and probably about 6 feet wide, I would say, something like that, 6, 7 feet wide. And so for 12 men to be in this boat, they were crowded. You know, it was usually meant for a couple of people to fish, or even one person to fish. And so there were 12 of them in this boat. And the sides of the boat, in Newfoundland, they call them gunnels. I don't know what they called them there, but that's what they called them where I came from. Were not high. They were probably only about, if the bottom was here, the keel, up, not high at all. And so the waves were whipping this thing up and coming over the side of this little boat, and so much so that they began to fear for their lives. They struggled all evening long. Seemed like it was one oar length forward and one back, and they were getting nowhere and getting more and more exhausted and getting more and more fearful, thinking this was surely their very last night on earth. It says at the 4th watch of the night. The night was divided up into these 3-hour segments. So the first segment would have been from 6 to 9, and then 9 to 12, and 1 to 3. So about 3 in the morning, this scene is before you, and the boat is getting tossed about and about ready to go under. They figured that this was it. It was all to be done with. And then they see Jesus, of course, They wished for him. They had hoped for him. They knew that things would be different if he were to come to them on the water or somehow be present with them. It is that time that they see this shadowy figure. Shadowy figure that looks like some kind of a misty creature coming on the water, and immediately all the rumors and stories and all of that began to flood your mind. They had never seen a ghost, but they imagined that this must be what a ghost would look like coming to them on the water. You know, it's interesting that we as people, as individuals, we go through times like that. We go through times when we feel like we're in a boat on the Sea of Galilee being tossed about. Struggles come and storms encounter and present themselves into our own lives. Maybe for some of you, discouragement comes when you have lost a loved one, someone who is close by, and you feel that you are rowing for your very life. Sometimes discouragements come when our children leave home and leave us and move to another place, and you feel somewhat discouraged. Sometimes these discouragements come because of relationships, interpersonal relationships that go awry. Spouse, when you come home, has left a message on the table for you. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I have talked to a number of people for whom that is a very real reality. Perhaps for others, the boat has been tossed in your life because of a variety of other things. Perhaps health issues strike. Not long ago, just a month or two ago, it was shared with me that this individual that I knew very well was diagnosed with cancer, and that it would be terminal. It had already spread. And that perhaps may be the boat tossing in your life. For all ages, whether young or old, they encounter these very same things. I'll tell you a short story. One evening, I was at home, and the phone rang, which is nothing unusual. As a pastor, the phone rings all kinds of hours. I prefer it before midnight, but it has happened many times after midnight as well. And on the phone was a young lady. And so the young lady was probably not more than about 32, something like that, if I remember right. And she told this story. She was sobbing and almost unintelligible as to what she was trying to get across and what she was trying to say to me. But anyway, I listened carefully, and eventually it became clear what it was she was saying to me. She said that she has a younger sister. And the younger sister was only about 16 years of age. And the younger sister, it turns out, she found herself in a situation where she was pregnant. And the parents, which were her parents as well as her younger sister's parents, said to the younger 16-year-old, well, we will help you. We can, you're welcome to remain living with us, and you're going to probably have to take a break from school at some point, and we will assist you to finish your education. But understand, this child is going to be your responsibility and not ours. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good thing. That's as good as you can hope for, right? And so I was not sure why she was so disturbed by this until she told me the rest of her story. And the rest of her story was, she said, why I'm so saddened by that is because when I was 16, I also found myself in the same situation. But it had been a number of years before. And my parents at the time said to me that I couldn't keep the child. They made arrangements for me to go off to another city in Toronto, a considerable ways away, and spend the next year there and give this child up for adoption. And then when it was all over and done, you could come back home and no one would know the difference. The story would be told that, oh, she just went to live with her aunt for a while for a new experience. But she was so distraught because she didn't get the same opportunities as her younger sister. And so the boat was rocking heavily in her life. She felt as if the boat was going to sink. But you know, even though we face many, many challenges, even though we face rocky episodes in our life, I have discovered there is an amazing thing, as did the disciples that particular night on the Sea of Galilee. For they saw coming through the mist a figure approaching them. At first they were fearful. You know, what is this? And then they heard the voice of Jesus and realized who it was. And suddenly everything changes. Everything changes. Christ's presence begins to give them great boldness and courage. They were no longer preoccupied with the notion that this boat was going to go down. They were no longer concerned about the waves and the wind and so forth, because they remembered Jesus sleeping in a boat before when the winds were like that. And with a wave of his hand, everything goes calm again. And so they become very confident. And one of them so much so that even though he had no thoughts of this before, he speaks out, and in the foam and the foment of that sea says to Jesus, "Come, can I come to you on the water? Will you allow me to walk on the water like you?" Christ always inspires faith. Always inspires faith. We found examples of it through the Old Testament in Gideon and Elijah and Joshua and so forth, who with the assurance of God were very brave individuals. And in the New Testament there are countless people who, when upon seeing Jesus, the leper was willing to approach him, who before was only allowed to dwell in some cave hidden off in seclusion. And the woman with the issue of blood came forward bravely to touch the hem of his garment. And people are just encouraged when Jesus is present. Peter says, "If it is you." By the way, for those of you who are Greek people here, there is a possibility in the Greek language is called the genitive and ablative case. And this could very well be meaning to say not if you are the Christ, but since you are the Christ. Since it is you, bid me come to you walking on the water. Now Jesus does not question his request. Jesus could have said, "Peter, I am astonished at you that you would ask such a thing. What a foolish and insane and impossible thing you are asking, walking on the water of all things. Don't you know this storm is against you? Look at the wind and the waves and the foment of the sea. This is all against you. It's not calm here at all. And besides, the law of gravity is against you. When you step out on this stuff, you're going to go down. That's the law of gravity is going to take you down." He says, "Peter, has anyone ever walked on the water before in all the history books that you have read? History is against you. No one has done this before." And he says, "Peter, you are a human being. People don't walk on water. Ducks can manage all right on the water and creatures like that, but your race is against you." I imagine what his brother thought, who was sitting in the boat with Peter. What did he think of what was going on? What did the other disciples think? What was going through their mind as they saw Jesus? I imagine they were just grateful it was Jesus. They knew that he had the power to control these unruly elements and to bring peace in an otherwise restless world. They knew that, but not Peter. Most of them, I imagine, probably said, Peter, you know, you're always putting your foot in your mouth. You're always speaking out. You're always the one who gets yourself in trouble, speaking when you should not be speaking. You're always the outrageous one. Why don't you just be quiet and sit where you are in the boat? I imagine his brother Andrew would have said something like that to Peter. Peter, you're always getting in trouble. Thomas would have said to Peter, I doubt that you can do this. I imagine that the others were there as well, the sons of thunder, James and John, and they would have probably said, Peter, this is too much even for us. Don't be doing such foolish things. But Peter, to his credit, you know, Peter's a brash guy. Usually we always think of Peter as someone who's getting himself in trouble, lopping off ears when he should not be doing such things, speaking out before the rooster crows. And all of those things are the things that we think of Peter. And we say he's not made of good material. He's unstable. He's not the guy that you want to look to. But you know what? Peter decides that he wants to take this risk with Jesus, to step out of the boat and go onto the water. So he drops his oars and he climbs out of the boat. Have you ever thought to yourself what it would be like to get out of the boat in a storm? It's only a small boat. And these waves are not, this is not the calm Sea of Galilee that you so often see the pictures of. This is now a row. How does one ever stand on, I mean, it's hard to stand on an escalator that's moving. What do you do with waves that are going up and down and bouncing left and right? How do you get your footing? How do you keep your balance? I would fall all over the place. However it was, Jesus allowed Peter to get out of the boat and begin to walk on the water. It's the only other human being besides Jesus himself, to my knowledge, who has ever walked on the water. Peter, you see, had dreamed of doing something. He dared to step out in faith. He ventured to stake his very life on this Christ. And you know what? I know we all know the story of Peter very well. We know that he gets out and he walks for a while, and then he looks away from Christ and begins to fall into the sea, and Jesus has to rescue him. And so sometimes we look at that part of the story. But you know what? I find this an amazing story. I find Peter to have captured that magic of faith that we all need to have, because he was willing to do the impossible. He was willing to do what no one else has ever prepared the way for. He was willing to venture it all upon Christ. He was willing to do something because his God was present and was blessing him. I wonder what it is this morning that God is calling you to. I wonder what he's calling me to. I know it wasn't very long ago, and they were looking for some officers for the Alberta conference. And they called up and said, would you be willing to let your name stand for this role here in Alberta? And, all kinds of thoughts go through your mind. Some people think it's a glamorous thing, but the reality is it's not so glamorous. And you wind up hearing the most difficult stories and facing the most challenging things in that particular role. And so they said, would you be willing to do that? And my first reaction is, are you crazy? Some people, by the way, some people have this misinformed notion. Oh, if you become president, you get a big pay raise. And you know how much you get? You get $100 a month difference. So I said to my wife, well, I could take you out for lunch once a month. And for that privilege, you get to hear all the stories and deal with all the issues and so forth. But I don't know what it is God calls you for. I don't know what he's calling you for. Perhaps you're a young person And He's calling you, if you're a young person, 16 to 20 or so, or of any age, I suppose, but I'm thinking more of the young people now, maybe He's calling you to ministry. Have you ever considered that? Maybe calling you to ministry. By the way, we are finding it more and more difficult to get people participate in ministry who have been raised in the church. Usually, most of our young people for ministry are people who are newly baptized or recently immigrated to Canada or something like that. It's all good, it's all fine, but we don't usually get people anymore. Rare that we get a person who was raised up into the church who applies for ministry. Maybe God is calling you for that. Yeah, it's not as glamorous. Certainly the wages don't compete with the police force or the nursing profession or some of those things. But God may be calling you to such a thing as that. Perhaps God is calling you and you're a little older. And maybe He wants you to do something significant for Him. He wants you to walk on water. Maybe He wants you, and it's even entered your mind once or twice, to take a role in the church officer list, whatever that may look like for you. And I just recognize another person here. How are you, George? And so maybe He's calling you for that, some sort of a ministry. I don't know what that is for you. Maybe He's calling you to be involved in hospital evangelism, or maybe He's calling you to start a small group, or maybe He's calling you to one of 100 other different things that He wants you to do for Him. I don't know what that is. But I do know that God, when He calls you, will also give you the power to do that which He has called you to do. There's much I could say about this passage, but I'm going to just tell you a story in closing. And that is to say that this is a story of faith. It is a story of adventure. It is a story of hope. And God wants that same story to be repeated in your life. If you are finding that life as a Christian for you is relatively dull, is relatively insignificant, is relatively routine, then maybe God wants you to do something for Him out of the ordinary. Think about it. That God may be calling you to some kind of a ministry in your life. Something that will require faith. Something that may even say to you, I don't even know if I can pull this off. I don't know. This may be bigger than me. That's okay. When you accept those challenges, God always provides the support and the means and the resources and the encouragement to see them happen. There are many, many people who respond in various ways. I know of a fellow who just recently retired, and prior to his retirement, him and his wife decided to take on a big responsibility. It's a big responsibility, and that is in it's found in one of the Caribbean countries, and they decided that they would start an orphanage there. He was familiar with it. He had lived down there, was raised there, and he knew the needs there. And he said, well, how am I ever going to do this? I don't have the resources to do it. I don't have anybody to help me. But he kept coming back to him. There are kids there who need his help. And so he begins, and he finds a house, and he finds some people who are willing to assist him. And in no time at all, it seems like this orphanage happened overnight, where all these kids are being helped and being provided an education and being provided medical assistance and being provided with just compassion. And so actually Elmira was just mentioning, my wife was just mentioning to the other day that she would like to go on a mission trip down there to spend some time in this orphanage helping out there. I don't know what God is calling you for. I'll tell you one short story and I will finish. Because it's really an adventure of faith that God wants you to have. Your life as a Christian should be an exciting, faith-filled adventure where you live every day in expectation that God is going to do something through you. It should be that way. It should be an exciting thing for you that you live each and every day. There was a lady, and this lady was probably in her early 20s. She had gone to school. She had finished her college training. And so she lived in Daytona Beach. Sounds pretty exotic. Of course, it was a generation or two ago. And she decided that she would start a school, a small school at the beginning, and it would grow and become a little bigger school as time goes on. She had no resources. She literally didn't have $2 to rub together. And she decided she would start this. So she began. So she found a little semi-abandoned, not really abandoned, but a run-down place. And she was able to rent it for a few dollars, this particular place. It had 4 rooms. And so she put a sign out there announcing that this would be a college. And of course it was her name, you'll recognize the story, I'm quite sure. Her name was Mary Bethune. And she was a lady who started a school for the black people of that area who were not privileged to be allowed into the regular schools. And so how it got started and how it continued was amazing. She had nothing to write with, no writing instruments. And so she took some firewood and chopped it and made these splinters and charred them up with a fire so that you could write with them. She found some berries that grew locally, alderberries or something, and she mashed them and made this concoction whereby the kids could use it with a stylus to write. And that's how they began. How they got there, this was a dormitory arrangement. And so how they got their beds were, as the kids came, first there was 5. That's what she began with. 4 girls and her own son were the nucleus of this new school. And so they went to the dump. And at the dump, they found an old crate. And they brought it back and they polished it up and cleaned it up and fixed it up. And that was the desk for the first room. And then they found some old sacks. And they brought them home and they washed them and they cleaned them up and they sewed them. And this was all part of their training. And then they stuffed it with some corn stalks to make a mattress, and they put it around. And there were many, many times in this adventure of faith where she didn't know where they would get their next meal from. One time in particular, she called the kids together and they prayed that God would provide for them. And just outside came 4 new students with tuition in hand. And so they were able to continue. And this was this miraculous story. Of course, Bethune College, you can look it up today, and it's a thriving school, and through the years has been providing education for countless young people who otherwise would not have had that privilege. This morning, God is asking us all to be fellow adventurers in faith, to walk on the water, as it were, and to have an exciting and interesting ministry in your own life so that your Christian experience is a vibrant one in which you relish to see what God is going to bring tomorrow. And so may God bless each one of you as you listen, because He speaks to all of us. Sometimes we brush it off so often that we don't hear it anymore. But start to pay attention. And God, if He hasn't already, and I know for many of you He has already provided that avenue, but I wish for all of you that great adventure of faith, that you will have a rich experience as you walk with Christ. God bless you.